Hello and welcome everybody here to Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 14. Today we have political movements, and this is an interesting one because I want to highlight this primarily because it is something that you may not have seen or that you may have forgotten. We talked in the past when it came to interest groups about the fact that interest groups cannot initiate any laws, and we said, hey, that's kind of weird, like we get it, when it comes to the gameplay dynamic itself, but of course interest groups should have an interest in actually pushing a law through. And that is basically, in completion, something that is talked about in this Dev Diary, and for me personally, at the very least, in a very satisfying way. I also want to inform you that I've been pretty stupid. I was informed that there would be a forum maintenance and that I could not check the dev responses. I wanted to, of course, include last week's dev responses in this video. Instead, I'm going to do it over the weekend. We're going to have a long video about me talking, about all your feedback and, of course, about the dev responses as well. So it is just the Dev Diary today. Alright, so let's jump in. I touched a little bit on this feature, so that is political movements, back in Dev Diary number 6, by saying that there are ways for politically disenfranchised pops to push for reform, though that isn't the entirety of the role that political movements fill in the game. What then are political movements? Put simply, a political movement is a way for your pops to make a direct demand of the government, either because they desire change or because they don't desire the change you are currently pushing through. Remember, passing a law takes time in this game. In this game, you can't just click and then it is a new law. Instead, there's a government debate. There could be, something that impacts the general mood of the country, of the interest groups, and so on and so forth. And maybe some people will even try to blockade this law from actually passing. A political movement is always aimed at one particular law and can take three different forms. Movements to preserve. This is a political movement that can form when there is sufficient opposition to the passing of a particular law. So if you initiate the passing of a law, let's say, and this is an example that they use here as well, you are Great Britain or you are Sweden, you are Prussia, whoever, and you want to get rid of the monarchy in favor of a republic, likely there would be a political movement that says, stop this immediately, we want to remain a monarchy, especially at the start of the game, of course. For example, if we have that, that's literally what they said in the next sentence. Movement to enact. This is a political movement that can form when there is popular demand for the enactment of a particular law. So, without you doing anything, without you taking any initiative, there will be people, similar to Victoria 2, of course, in this case, that just say, we want this passed. This is important to us. It is more multifaceted than it was in Victoria 2, where it was driven by the pops, themselves, and they basically went and said, we want this and we're gonna rebel if you don't do it. For example, if you have a politically active and literate but very poor underclass of laborers, these laborers might form a movement to create a minimum wage. Makes sense. And then the last one is movement to restore. This is a political movement that works exactly like a movement to enact, but aims specifically to bring back a law that was previously in effect in the country. For example, a movement to restore the monarchy in a Britain that successfully transition into a republic. The main differences between a movement to restore and a movement to enact is that the former will tend to get some extra support from being able to harken back the golden era of the past, instead of having to champion new ideas. Of course, that is true. I do think that this is quite close to reality, the way that they form, but we're going to take a look at that as well in just a couple of seconds. But this idea that you basically have it easier to say, hey, it was nicer back then, let's just do that again, right? That is generally easier because people look back and either they experienced it and actually were in a better position, maybe there's some nostalgia, maybe they heard stories from older generations about that. So this is very much something that I like. So we have preservation, we have enactment, and we have restoration when it comes to political movements. Political movements have a singular goal and will exist only so long as this goal remains unfulfilled. Their impact on the country in pushing for said goal is determined by their support score. A political movement can have support from both interest groups, which represents a part of the political establishment backing the movement, and individual pops, which represents individuals championing the movement in the streets. I like this exact point. I really like that a lot, and let me get into the details of why I like it so much. We talked about this in particular when it comes to the topic of, hey, what do we do about influencing movements and influencing people that have something against their government, that want either something rolled back, that want something new, or that want to preserve something? How do you deal with them? And the answer in Victoria 2 was not directly. The answer was you either suppress them, you press the button, suppress, you go ahead and you actually kill them in their open rebellion that would eventually start, or you pass the law. There was no really direct correlation there. Of course, it all was related to, how they felt, how much their needs were covered and whatnot, but at the end of the day, there was no direct way of influence other than, I'm gonna kill you, or I'm going to go ahead and pass the law. This has changed. Not just because, of course, we have pops and, the standard of living and how that works in general is something that is much more influenced by how things go and what you do now in comparison to Victoria too, especially if you, for example, cater to their obsessions. They may be happier than, otherwise and would likely not join any political movements. But what is more important here for me is the fact that the interest groups, although they do not have any initiative to actually pass a law that you are not deciding to pass, the interest groups form or are part of the political movements. Right here we have, for example, outlawed dissent. That is the, I believe, the conservative interest group. So that would be the military, the church, and the bourgeoisie. Maybe farm owners. I'm honestly not quite sure what this is. And then on here we have the enact census suffrage. So what we have right here is industrialists, and we have the intellectuals. And this is really interesting because what we can now do is, of course, this level of support and the strength of the political movement, they are derived from the idea of, okay, what are we looking at? Who is supporting it? And instead of just saying I need to raise the general standard of standard of life for my pops, you can also simply say I'm going to take, for example, let's say the militarists, and I'm going to move them to be happy with me. If they're happy with me, they will not join the political movement. This is so much better when it comes to how granular you can decide who you want to sort of placate so that you can then go ahead and not have a political movement be dangerous to you. Now, what we see here is, of course, the conservatives, they are looking to go back to the future. This is, or go back to the future, to go back to the past by enacting an outlawed dissent law, making it harder, to say anything wasn't necessary in the past, but now it is. And it brings us back to the state where people are not allowed to talk. And on the other hand, the census suffrage would make it so that rich people would be significantly better off when it comes to voting. So, of course, the industrialists and the intellectuals support it. Interest groups will provide support for the movement based on their clout, while pops provide support based on raw numbers compared to population as a whole. Meaning that a single discriminated laborer backing a movement provides just as much support as a fully enfranchised aristocrat when taking action outside their interest group. So basically, pops, obviously, they lean towards an interest group. And that interest group, from these pops leaning into them, get clout, and that clout is then applied by these interest groups joining in on a political movement. I do wonder whether one interest group can be in support of multiple political movements at the same time. I assume that's not the case, but I'm not entirely certain because it's not mentioned. But the interesting thing here is you can still have pops that are in an interest group, and that interest group might support something in particular. These pops can still then, in person, basically support it. You can see right here, 127k, of course, is more than 74.3k, so people want to outlaw dissent more than they want census suffrage. Now, what I do want to highlight is that we are looking at a situation where both the political strength, so an aristocrat, for example, in a government that makes it so that aristocrats have a lot to say in it, will be very influential and will give a lot of influence to the interest group. But if that aristocrat does join one of the political movements themselves, they won't really be doing that much because it's just one person, right? This is the basic idea behind this, meaning that the political power still comes into play with the interest groups, but you can take that away by moving the interest groups away from a movement, right? While political strength still plays an important role in political movements in the form of interest groups throwing their clout behind movements championing laws they like, it is entirely possible for a political movement to form with no interest group backing it at all. Even if nobody is willing to champion workers' rights in the halls of power, enough angry workers in the streets may just be enough to affect change anyway. Very interesting because we have this sort of intertwined dynamic. Again, we didn't have that at all in Victoria 2, but then again, Victoria 2 was developed in 1 year pre-release and then I believe another year for the DLCs. So we're looking at a situation where, obviously you need to be better than Victoria 2 here, but this is an interesting dynamic because it really approaches it from, do I want to address this in the streets or do I want to address this in the halls of power? So, talking to the interest groups. Which interest groups will or will not back a political movement depends on whether they would approve of a change to the new law in case of enact or restore, or disapprove of the current change in progress in case of preserve. Interest groups that have high approval or which are part of the government will not support political movements, though government interest groups may put pressure on you in other ways if they're not pleased with your actions. I wonder what that is. Maybe just dropping out of government and leading to societal, uncertainty, who knows. Pops are more complex, as they can back a political movement either because it aligns with their political movement, for example, their preferred interest group. So, you would have to assume that if the intellectuals as an interest group back enact census suffrage, that many of these people in here are actual intellectuals, but it could also be that, maybe somebody that is an up-and-coming bourgeoisie member, that just says, I'm here for the little business, they themselves might say, I want to join on the streets here despite, my interest group not actually supporting it. That is really interesting, again, because it does bring this intertwined double mechanic in there. Interest groups that have high approval, or, oh no, there we were. Pops are more complex, right, as they can back a political movement either because it aligns with a political movement, or because they have something to gain directly from it. For example, a discriminated pop backing a movement that would give them more rights. Yeah, there you go. I really like that. You might be a discriminated pop that can't join an interest group, for example, but you will still say, yeah, obviously I support this, right? This is a grand idea for me. Even though your interest group vote itself doesn't mean anything because you're too disenfranchised. This political movement to abolish the regressive poll tax is currently only backed by the trade unions and pops sympathetic to them. Let's take a look at this. Enact no poll tax support. From clout of supporting interest groups, so that's plus 7%, and then supported by 290,000 pops, plus 6%. That is pretty good. That is a lot of percentage. I assume that the percentages up here are fairly similar in, what the impact is. Of course, everybody counts for one. Actually, they don't count for one. If I look at this, right? I think this is probably rounded to 6%, right? And these numbers are not final, but I want to think about this for a second. I would assume that it is, it's based, right, no, I'm an idiot. It's based on your total population. So this must be around 6% maybe of the total population, maybe that's how it's counted. But yeah, pretty nice. The support score of a political movement has two direct effects on legislation. Firstly, it affects the chance of successfully passing a law, making it easier to pass the law the movement wants in the case of a movement to enact restore, and more difficult to replace in the case of a movement to preserve. So, let's say you have the law to make the country a republic, and you have the majority of interest groups, so basically your parliament or whoever decides it, right, whatever your country's representation sort of is of these interest groups, you have a majority behind you to pass it. But all of a sudden, the people on the streets, they say, we don't want this. The interest groups that are not in government say, we don't want this either. And all of a sudden, this will take ages. The debate will be drawn out. The effect of the instability that may come from this, from the country basically being torn apart, will be much more noticeable than, if you actually had other interest groups that are not in government, and all the people that are actually just sitting around and thinking about the fact whether they should be a republic or, a kingdom or a monarchy. All of these people all of a sudden make it way harder compared to, again, if they didn't feel that way. And I really like that idea. Again, it pushes us into a different interaction here, I think, with the world that is our internal politics, where it says, yes, you can pass it, but you haven't done enough footwork. You haven't, really made the people agree with this concept on a very fundamental, let's say 2/3 of the nation should agree before you pass it, because it is such a fundamental change to your existence as a state, and they will make it very, very hard. I would love to see what that actually looks like. We know that this does happen. We've seen that in the interest group, no, in the laws, I believe, Dev Diary. We've seen that, again, there is a debate going on in Parliament, or, again, whatever it is. But I don't know just how that actually plays out. Yet again, one of those things, I wish we had some gameplay. Having a movement to enact or restore also allows a country to attempt to pass the law the movement wants, even if said law has no backing among the interest groups in government, which usually would be impossible because, of course, your interest groups are in a position where they say, hey, we want to do what we want to do, that's why we're in government. You can't just, have the communist rule and then say, free market, laissez-faire for everybody. This is the dream. You can't do that. But if you have communists in government and then there's a really strong, basically ground-based sort of operation that says we would like to do open markets despite electing you, but we kind of don't feel that way anymore, right? We can now go and essentially say, well, yeah, we can still pass it though, because we have all these people on the streets and all these interest groups working in this way. I would like to see, again, there as well, how you actually pass it though, because let's assume that you have a parliament, you still need a parliamentary majority, right? If you have a government and none of them are actually backing this, but all of the opposition backs it, right? And then many people on the streets, let's say over 50% back it. How do they pass it though? Because these 50%, they have pressure, but they are not in parliament. I would be interested in that. I don't know how it impacts interest groups, of course, but yeah, let's move on to a really interesting topic, because again, as it is intertwined, we finally learn about radicalism and about loyalty from the pops. That has been a big topic. We know that you become radical if you have a very low standard of living. You become loyal if you're doing incredibly well. So let's just check out how that actually goes. This is where the radicalism of a political movement comes in if you don't want to pass anything. Radicalism Radicalism is based on the number of radical pops and clout of angry interest groups supporting the movement. A movement with low radicalism is one that is intent on getting its wishes heard through peaceful means, while a movement with high radicalism is willing to use more extreme methods, up to and including sparking a revolution, but we're going to talk about that in a different dev diary. Replacing the monarchy with a republic is not a popular idea in Sweden in 1836. The opposition is both strong and highly radicalized. A civil war is all but guaranteed unless the government reverses course. So I assume it would probably just radicalize people if this movement to preserve the monarchy wasn't radicalized, as it is, radicalism 234%, right? If it wasn't that radicalized, and you would still pass this law against a very, very strong reaction by people that, are in this political movement, you would probably simply radicalize them, right? That is probably the effect, making it so that the next law that you might want to pass would have many more radical pops in there. So I think that is probably how you do that if you pass something that people don't want, right? And you just go ahead. In this case, it will spark a civil war, right? But if you don't have the actual requirements for a civil war, it will just bring you closer towards a civil war. Very, very nice. Much, much better than like Victoria 2's, what time is it? It's a narco-liberal rebellion. Now they will only rebel if they actually are in a position where it would make some sense and where there is a coherent setup of people that actually want to do it. Preserve monarchy, the radicalism of this movement, is 234%. The interest groups are angry, and being angry makes it so that they actually add to radicalism. I assume that they are not angry in any of these, so they're just, we disapprove, but also we're not really angry. Although, it definitely works the same. In this case, they're just, not approving, but they're not angry. And in this one, then we have 38,000 radicals out of the 229,000 pops that are in the movement. That adds plus 45% radicalism. Yeah, that is pretty crazy. You're gonna have a civil war over your monarchy. It is by no means a sure thing that every peaceful movement will become radical, and movements may very well fizzle out without accomplishing their goals, but ignoring the wishes of a significant part of your population and or political establishment does come with some associated risks. Let's talk about radicalists and loyalists. The first thing that should be understood about radicals and loyalists is that just like with interest group membership, radicals and loyalists are not whole pops but rather individuals within pops. Starting a game as France by hiking the taxes up as high as possible and slashing government military salaries is a surefire way to watch the number of radicals quickly climb. Oh my god. Wow, this is 1.5 months. And we've reached 1.67 million radicals out of 33.9 million people. I mean, we have 6,000 loyalists. Yeah, the entire country hates us. Here's the standard of living, that is literacy, and this is the GDP. This is Ireland. Look at that. Radicals are individuals who have become disillusioned with the government and political apparatus of the country and want to seek change through any means necessary, while loyalists are patriots who are genuinely willing to put their political views and goals aside for the sake of the nation. There's a large variety of ways that pops can become radicals or loyalists. Here's a few of the more common reasons listed below. Let me just chime in here, because this actually opens up a gameplay style that we did not have in Victoria 2, and that wasn't possible. It just wasn't achievable in that game. But essentially what we have right here is, let's assume that you are Russia, and you are a very benevolent Tsar. Now there will be, as you go on, a lot of, social democrats, republicans, communists, whatever. Maybe just somebody that doesn't like the Tsar in general, maybe, anti-Orthodox Church, of course, which would be very interwoven in your monarchy. But what you can do, instead of being like, well, I guess I'll give in and I'll be a social democrat now. No, what you can do is, you can sit down and essentially say, I will make you so filthy rich, I will make you so happy with other things that I do that you will not radicalize, throw firebombs, try to kill me, and then have ultimately a Soviet Union revolution, right? This is, again, a playstyle that we have talked about in the past, that the devs have talked about in the past, and should, if this system works, as it is described here, should in fact actually make it so that you can go on and run a country without, really going after the ideas of the people. Because if they're happy, if they're wealthy enough, then they won't really say anything, even if they would like to vote, for example. Now, how can they actually change between radicals and loyalists? An increase in material living standards will become more loyal, of course. Decrease in material living standards, yep, that is radical, makes sense. Standard of living is below the minimum that they expect to have, will radicalize them over time, particularly if it's so low that they are actually starving. I believe that would be level 1 to 4. I wonder, now I'm looking at it, did we ever talk about what standard of living they are expecting? If we did, then could you let me know in the comments? It sounds like a profession thing, but it might just be like a literacy thing. I can't recall. Please do let me know if they did mention how the expectation is generated. Also, pops that are literate but discriminated against tend to radicalize over time. Makes sense. Yeah, you're educated, you know what should be your rights, and you don't have them. So you want them, and you want them in whatever radical way possible. Pops from political movements whose demands are ignored may radicalize over time, of course, and pops from political movements that have their demands fulfilled become loyal. Yeah, basically, if we have somebody that says we want to vote and we ignore it, obviously not immediately they're gonna throw firebombs at us, but eventually, if we ignore it for too long, if this same pop goes into the same group again and again and again, into different groups that we all ignore, they will radicalize and they will indeed become very aggressive. Makes a lot of sense to me at the very least. This is an interaction where I can make both. Either I can say, hey, I'm going to make it so that these people are no longer unhappy because they are loyal to me by, hey, giving into some demands, maybe just making them wealthier, and then I can get rid of interest, or rather of movements that way. Or I can go and say, okay, so you get like 100, or rather you get like, let's say 20% support from having 3 interest groups in there, but your actual pop support is only like 5%. So if I take away these 20% by making the interest groups happy on another topic, I can ignore this political movement. Of course, it radicalizes the pops, but it doesn't really do anything else. This is an approach that I was dreaming of. I've experienced this, and many of you probably won't know this, but I also covered the CK3 dev diaries long before release, and every time there was something where I was like, oh, I don't know, I really wish this was in the game. Most of the time, they came with a dev diary and basically said, yeah, we're doing that. Obviously, we're doing that. And this is one of them. We talked about it. We said we would like, or rather I said, some agreed, some disagreed, of course. I said I would really love it if we had more interaction opportunities with, political movements, with rebels, with people that become unhappy. And it is done here in 2 ways, with the interest groups and the actual population membership of a movement. So for me personally, honestly, this sounds really good. We can definitely make a lot out of this. Radicals and loyalists generally function in directly opposite ways. For example, radicals are more likely to create and join political movements, as well as contributing to radicalizing said movements, while loyalists will never join political movements. Loyalists make the interest groups they are part of happier, while radicals make them less happy, and so on. This means that one way to prevent political activism and curtail movements that oppose your agenda is to increase the standard of living of your pops. Just because you at some point during the game created prosperity, however, does not mean everyone will just be on board with your program forever. Pops will remain radical or loyalist until they either die or have a status change as a result of becoming more radical loyal. For example, a loyalist pop might stop being a loyalist if their material standard of living suddenly takes a nosedive, but they do in fact die. As generations die off and they are replaced by new ones, less and less people will remember all the great things that you did for the country 30 years ago. They will start wondering instead what you've done for them lately. So, they talked about dying actually, pops dying in the past, because of course it also impacts the qualification rate for professions, and it impacts their literacy. But so the way they describe it, you don't literally see, 200 grandmothers out of this 10,000 strong pop just died. The way it works, as I understand it, is basically that it calculates, of course, these people, if a pop grows as it goes on, there will be a difference. In the literacy standard that they could have in the past, and once these people die, the literacy standard will trend up. I think it's more a trend rather than a real number of somebody dying. It could always be 10,000 pops, and then you would just have a trend that basically shows you, okay, so the old generation, they had really good schools, then you pass, private schools, and nobody wants to fund them, so now we're down here, and they will slowly trend down here with a goal of down there. So this is basically a goal system similar for loyalists, of course. If you just do something good, it will be here, and then as time passes, again, there's no real, as I understand, a calculation of deaths, but it will trend, let's say, towards 50%, so they're just normal, they're not unhappy, they're not happy, and this will trend down, and it basically simulates death. This sounds maybe a bit weird. I hope I got what I wanted to say there across. There's definitely a mechanic that approximates, that does an approximation of people dying and new generations shifting in, but the way I understand it is fundamentally that you don't actually see, these people died in that pop. Obviously, it doesn't make any sense. We're not on that scale, but instead it's just the old generation was basically up here. Now that the requirements are different, the goal of the new generation will be down here. And as 23 years or, 30, 40 years pass, you will slowly but surely drift towards this new requirement. I'm pretty sure that is how they simulate, or rather emulate, aging. Anyway, when it comes to making pops happy, making pops unhappy, making groups happy, making groups unhappy, and then these groups can be unhappy or happy because of people in that group that are loyalists or radicals, and the political movements are made up of the loyalists and radicals, and then in that movement you also have just normal pops. I think This is a really good system because it really lets us approach the idea of society building from various angles. You can be incredibly repressive, you can be incredibly negative, you can be incredibly reformist, you can do something that is a revolution, you can cause this, of course. If you make a very specific subsection of the population unhappy, you could surely, if we think about this, right, if we initiate basically that the militarists and that the monarchists, so the conservative forces, the landowners and whatnot, that they are very radicalized and unhappy, any revolution wouldn't lead to, here's my communist revolution, right? Instead, it would say, okay, these interest groups and these pops have this relative ideology. What will be the outcome? What would they demand in this new state? I'm very excited once we actually get to the topic of revolutions, because I think that this one could get a lot more interesting than Victoria 2. Victoria 2 was cool, especially if we look at other grand strategy games. I think EU4 does it as well, but in Victoria 2, it was basically regular gameplay to say, I'm gonna run my country into the gutter so that I can then arise anew as whoever rebels against me. But you sort of had to gamble for who would rebel and what you were doing, who you were aggravating there, you know, whether you would get a bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or whether you would get a communist revolution and so on and so forth. If we can actually direct it here, who becomes angry, why they become angry, and what we can do about it, I think that should become much more interesting. Of course, it will also be interesting to see how warfare and how revolutions even work in this game, but that's a topic for another time, I think. Very interesting dev diary. I really like the system that they are implementing. It certainly gives me the idea that we can have a lot of freedom in how we design our civilization or our society, because we can actually drift them purposely, make some people happy, make some people very unhappy in a very guided way. Next up will be slavery. Very, very interested. I hope that we hear a lot about maybe even mechanics of the, you know, getting rid of slavery in the southern states, for example. What was mentioned beforehand in a very early dev diary was basically the idea, hey, if you win the civil war, or you can even forego the civil war, you can make them happy. You can, for example, forbid slavery and then go on and still keep them very, very subsidized, for example, and all of a sudden they won't rebel. All of a sudden they will go, yeah, we're not going to do anything about it because our wealth isn't impacted by this at all. I would be very interested in seeing that, but that's for next week. Let me know what you thought about this dev diary, and thank you very much for watching the video, for taking part in the conversation. Thank you all members of the channel, of course, and I'll see you later. Alligator.